Hey Cam, question for you, but I think I already know the answer. Are you a dog person or a cat person?
Oh, come on. You know I'm a dog person. Although I have owned a cat before, and I used to not like cats, but I've come to appreciate them. But when push comes to shove, I'm definitely a dog person.
Yeah, I've always been a dog person too, which partly explains my two dogs, Loki and Taz. When my kids wanted pets and they were older, it had to be dogs. But when they were younger and I was traveling a lot for research, we first got them a cat that they named Olaf. And I gotta be honest, he's pretty awesome too, and he's grown on me as well.
Yeah, like I've said, I get along with cats, and our former cat and I got along okay. But the cat, it had a mind of its own, and it wasn't always looking for companionship, I guess. And I know many cats are sweet, and that's okay. But for me, the best time is when I come home from work. I open the door and Dashi jumps all over me, and then he runs over to the couch, and I follow him to the couch, and we play and tumble, and it's a highlight of my day.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of my favorite parts as well. And it kind of makes me wonder this aloofness in cats, it's not an appealing kind of behavior. Why did humans ever domesticate cats in the first place?
Well, great question, and actually great timing to ask that question, because there was a super cool paper that just came out in Science last week on the origins of the domestic cat, or to be specific, Felis catus. So the old idea was that actually no one really domesticated the cat, at least not to be pets. Cats became domesticated when our ancestors decided that it was good to keep cats around because they killed mice. And killing mice was good for keeping the grains around. So the pet thing probably came secondarily.
Oh, yeah, I saw that paper. It was by Marco de Martino, Claudio Toni, and a bunch of others. And they found that the story of cat domestication was much more complicated than we first thought. The domesticated cat in Europe didn't come from the Levant 9,500 years ago, or even Egypt about 3,500 years ago, as was originally thought. Instead, it seems there were probably two much more recent introductions of the ancestor of domesticated cats, the African wildcat or Felis libica, into Europe.
Yeah, so the first introduction to Europe was probably about 2,200 years ago from Northwest Africa into Sardinia. And the other came from somewhere else in North Africa, a bit more recently, probably in the last 2,000 years.
Right. So, although cats might have been prominent in Egyptian art for more than 4,000 years, if those cats were domesticated then, those domesticated cats didn't reach Europe until quite a bit more recently than anthropologists originally thought.
Yes, and a very cool story, but I still prefer dogs.
Okay, fine. Switching gears. How do you feel about horses?
Horses? I'm terrified of horses. Is this show just going to be about you asking me what my favorite domesticated species is, or do you have a point here?
Oh, well, kind of both. We're going to talk a lot more about domestication, but we're going to stick with the domestication of this other iconic species, the horse. It's the research focus of our guest today, Ludovic Orlando, who's been a research director for the French National Center for Scientific Research since 2016, the founder and director of the Center for Anthropobiology and Genomics since 2020, and the author of the new book, Horses, A 4,000-Year Genetic Journey Across the World.
Of course. And I forgot to tell you that in honor of dropping this episode with Ludo, I rewatched the 1981 Clash of the Titans the other night. The original one with all the stop motion action, not the more recent CGI one. And what was most amazing about it was how majestic Pegasus, the horse, was. The winged horse that flies through the sky in between the monsters and never spooks. We should have asked Ludo about Pegasus.
Yeah, but every horse owner knows that Pegasus is 100% fictional and not just the flying part. Real horses won't walk past their own shadow if it shows up at the wrong angle.
Exactly, which is why Pegasus is a great starting point for a conversation about horse domestication. If ancestral horses were prey animals with anxiety levels that would make a Chihuahua look stoic, how could we ever domesticate them?
Great question. And this very issue probably partly explains why horse domestication happened so recently compared to most other domesticates. It took a very special horse lineage to transform a high strung grazer into what we'll hear was truly an engine of human history.
And clearly, it's still a work in progress, as even Secretariat and Mr. Ed would probably see a plastic bag as an existential threat.
Ah ha ha. Before we get to horses with Orlando, remember that we're still in fundraising mode.
Our goal is 500 paid Substack subscribers, and we're well on our way there. Thanks so much to all of our new subscribers. We're doing really great in gaining the number of paid listeners that we need to keep making episodes.
And when you subscribe, you'll get access to full shows, as well as all of our back catalog. And for the next few weeks, for every 20 new paid subscribers, we're also going to randomly pick a subscriber, new or old, to receive a Big Biology t-shirt or a poster with a cover art from the show. And you get to pick the image.
So for a chance to win, and just to support our cause, go to bigbiology.substack.com and sign up. For as little as the cost of a cup of coffee per week, you can do your part to keep the episodes coming. As you'll see on Substack, it's up to you to decide how you want to support us.
And in fact, if you can't afford a subscription, that's fine. We'll never let money keep you from listening and learning about biology. So if you can't afford a subscription, you can sign up at Substack for free.
But if you are a paid subscriber, prizes are not the only part of what you get. Paid subscribers also get access to behind-the-scenes discussions from Marty and me about the show, as well as extra audio from our guests about their lives and hobbies.
So please go to bigbiology.substack.com and sign up today. It's the holiday season, and what better way to help your niece, nephew, son, daughter, or family friend prepare for college or grad school than by giving a subscription to Big Biology?
And for you PIs out there, consider giving your lab members a gift subscription to Big Biology.
Thanks again for all of your support on Substack, but also a great big thanks to all of our patrons and other donors that help us keep the lights on. And happy holidays to all.
I'm Cameron Gallenbohr.
And I'm Marty Martin.
And this is Big Biology.
Ludovic Orlando, welcome to Big Biology.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we invited you on to talk about this amazing new book, Horses, a 4,000-year genetic journey across the world. Full disclosure, I've never been a horse person, and I don't mean any offense by that. I've loved every horse ride I've ever taken. I've just not been around them much, but that just meant that most of the material in the book was new to me, and it was, fun to read and so many amazing facts. But I want to start by asking, how did you get into horse science? Was it an accident, some relation with a hobby or a family history? How did it start?
No, that's a great question. And thanks for reading my text, actually. So I'm not a horse person either, right? So, and in fact, the last chapter of that book is the story about me and horses. How did it start and how did it unfold? And in fact, for probably 44 years of my life, my history with a horse was one of a failure. I could have met that animal, but I always missed it. It started at high school when, I was given the choice to do sport a day a week, and I would be sailing or horse riding. And of course, I went sailing, right? And it goes on and on and on, including during my PhD work, actually, when I was, lucky enough to meet some very, very prominent scientists interested in horses, trying to convince me that animal was something worth studying. And I was more interested into Neanderthals and cave bears, extinct species, as opposed to these species. But then at some point, and this is, I guess, the serendipity we have as a scientist in our lives, right? I came across when I just started my group at the University of Copenhagen back in 2010, I came across one fossil, which was from a horse. And that fossil was something special because it was dating back to 780,000 years ago, almost a million year old. And so we started studying that just for the sake of testing whether it will be possible to do whole genome sequencing, that is sequencing the whole DNA of an extinct animal when it's that old in the past. The world record at that time was around 50,000 years. We made it to 780,000. And of course, to succeed in doing that, we had to invest a lot on thinking, what is a horse? How can we study the evolution of a horse? And so by doing this work, I just realized, but very naively, in fact, that the horse had everything to it. It was not only the animal, the textbook animal of evolutionary biology, but it was equally so the one of human history, because we built that world, on the horseback for many thousand years. And the minute I realized that, I think I was hooked, as a scientist, because I just found the animal that, integrated all my interest, evolutionary biology and history.
Did you write the book now for a reason? I mean, presumably you could have waited. You're still doing a lot of research, and we'll talk about that. But is there some particular reason that you decided now was the time to write the book?
Absolutely. So, we started 2010, as I said, and for pretty much 15 years, we've been after three main questions. And I guess most of the people will be surprised to hear that we did not know any answer to those questions. And those questions were really simple. It was when, where, and how did we domesticate the horse for the first time? When you think about, cows or sheep or goats or other animals, we have the answers to those questions. But for horses, we did not. And of course, those questions, it's easy to ask them, it's far more difficult to answer them. And so for 15 years, we've been after those answers. And I felt that now was the time because we could actually very confidently bring the answers to those questions. We found really when and where and how did we succeed in doing so.
Good. Well, I'll confess I'm also not a horse person. And the time I've spent around horses, I guess I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I find them very intimidating. I mean, they're large animals. And when you stand next to a horse, like you feel small. So you alluded to, the simple question. So I think maybe that's a good place for us to start our conversation of, what is the evidence for, especially when and where horses were first domesticated. The subtitle of your book says a 4,000-year history, and it really unfolds like a detective story, I think, with lots of different clues about key events, but also integrating not just genetic information, but also a lot of archaeological information. I know this covers a lot, but let's start to summarize the evidence and how you concluded the geographic origin and timing of domestic horses. And maybe this will first take us to a site in Kazakhstan that you went to.
Yeah, so absolutely. Maybe I should say a few words about why did we not get any evidence before we got these answers to those questions, right? Is that as opposed to cows, for example, when we domesticated the horse, we didn't start by changing their morphoanatomy big time. They didn't become like giants overnight. And so if you don't have such a large shift in how they look, archaeologists will not have necessarily obvious hints to tell that horse was a domestic one and the other one was not, right? So it becomes the frontier between domesticated animals and wild animals because becomes a lot more blurry to some extent, right? So, and because it was blurry, there was a number of suggestions that it could have been in one region or in another one. For example, archaeologists for decades really have used hints such as, oh, what is the context in which those animals are buried? Is it with us? If this is close to us, then probably this means something like a relationship between us and this animal. But really, some people could have been buried with a hunted horse as well, right? So that's why when and where was really difficult to track. And so this is not for the lack of trying. People have tried over and over again for decades, really, but not conclusive enough. So our take was radically different, right? So I'm a geneticist, I'm trained in molecular biology and computational biology. And so the little I know is about this. How can we leverage the text information that is present in the DNA sequences? And that text is probably recording a number of things such as how many horses were around at a given time in the past, which colors did they have, what were the traits they were having, and these sort of things. And so our bet was that probably if we sequence DNA back in time, so for example, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we could actually replay backwards in time the movie of domestication to some extent. Imagine that you have a picture of the horses roaming around today around the world. Then you travel 200 years ago. Maybe you will see where their ancestors were living. And so probably it's not going to be the whole world, but probably a subset of that area, right? And so now if you move 500 years earlier again, then you will probably narrow down this sort of region where they were domesticated first. And so it sounds very easy. It is actually exactly what we've been doing. The difficulty was go get around and get fossils or archaeological remains throughout the whole planet to sort of replay the genetic movie. And so this is where I guess I'm the one speaking and I'm the one writing the book, but you have to picture that this is literally several hundreds of collaborators and contributors who have actually excavated the world really for decades. Without them, none of that will be possible. And of course, like I guess very often in science, we've been extremely lucky because the genetic movie we could replay was absolutely informative because of the way domestication happened, right? Imagine, for example, that domestication was a sort of idea that many people had around. And so, for example, someone in the US, someone in my country, in France, or in Italy, or in Russia, will have got the same idea at the same time and started to do that. There will be many regions to actually track down, right, which might be more difficult to unfold. But in our case, there was hardly two regions, in fact, one of which we can show was a region where everything started but also collapsed. Those people that you alluded to in central Kazakhstan 5.5 thousand years ago, we call them the Botai people. They had a particular way of burying themselves and also a particular way to live. They were actually settled people, not nomads, but they were hunter-gatherers, right? And what they were interacting with the most was horses. And there is a moment when they started to, the horse population started to collapse and they needed somehow to secure their resource a lot more. So that's how they started to interact with the animal to make their resource, the meat, more stable over time. But at some point, those people collapsed. They actually vanished, as many people actually vanish in history. And so the horse went back feral. So this first attempt was not the success we know about. By that, I mean the horse that we ride today with more or less talent. But there is a second time, which is 4.2 thousand years ago, between 4 and 4.5 thousand years ago. It takes a few centuries to really create this creature. But then, and this is actually not in Central Asia, this is still in the Steppe region, but this is in the lower Don Volga region, somewhere north of the Caucasian Mountains, probably southwest of Russia, if you see the geography of this region that way. So those people in this region, not the Botai people at all, they reinvented a new way to interact with the horse. And at that time, this animal, whatever it was, became the global thing that we call the domestic horse. In our data, we see that from that minute part of the world, a region of a few hundred kilometers, really, the horse was really confined to this very small territory, but they bred out a new type of bloodline there. And this bloodline made history because in a few centuries, we saw it expanding and spreading across first the old world, I mean, Eurasia, and then way later on to other places, including Africa, America, and so forth. So because of this process being to some extent simple, you have one people at some point creating something that becomes so fashionable that the whole world wanted to have it. Think about mobile phone today, right? We didn't have them 30 years ago, and all of a sudden all of us have them. Because it was that nature of a process, we could be quite confident in the answer we could have to these questions.
Yeah. Okay. So all of the horses that are here today derive from this group, but the horses that were sort of originally domesticated, what was their distribution and what kind of diversity was there for horses around the time of this event?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. In fact, through our work, we have replayed the genetic movie to the domestication start, but in fact, to before that time, up to 780,000 years ago, actually, so we have a fairly good understanding of their diversity when it comes to the genetic diversity that is written in DNA texts to some extent. And so that was a big surprise to me because, for today, the world of horses is very simple, domestic, or what we call the Przewalski's horse. There is 60 million domesticates around the world, 3,000 or so Przewalski's horses native from Mongolia. So very simple situation. If you do this genetic movie backwards in time to say 4 or 5,000 years ago, by the time the domestication started, you realize that there were dozens of genetic types. In other words, there were dozens of blood types, but things that were massively different. For example, in my country here, we had a number of lineages of horses that were different to Spain next door or different to Germany next door. And in fact, you should picture the diversity of horses before us to some extent as a sort of regional differentiation of populations. And that happens genetically only if that animal doesn't move around too far. If animals move around too far, they mix, and so that means that they will share the same DNA text. And so because they were so differentiated, what we learned, that was really my surprise, was that before us, the horse was not mobile. It was an animal that basically lived where it was born and died where it was born to some extent, right? So in terms of number of lineages, it's dozens, literally, and I'm absolutely sure we haven't finished uncovering them all. It's dozens. But what is really important to understand is that they had a geographic structure. In other words, in different parts of the world, you had different types. And so that's why we could answer the where question, because we only had to track back in time the genetic ancestries that make up the modern horse to some extent.
The structure that was there, was that in any way related to people? I think there was allusions in the book about sort of the geography keeping different populations isolated from each other, but that wasn't something driven by people per se for food or milk or anything like that. It was just the natural sort of goings on of horse populations.
Yeah, I think so. One of the main drivers before people was climate, in fact. So we have a number of results in our work where we show that, by and large, when climate goes cold, populations expand. Populations of horses, I meant, right? It's not a general rule for all the mega herbivores, but for the horses, it holds. And so when it gets warmer, it shrinks. So you have a situation in which, for example, you're in the US. So imagine Beringia, this sort of large continent that was a bridge between your continent, the Americas, and my continent, Eurasia. Depending on the climate, the sea levels were higher or lower. And if this was lower, all of it is said that you had a bridge, a physical bridge, bridging those two continents. When you have that, which is climate driven, of course, there are populations of horses that can go both ways. So you realize that depending on the climate, you will have a world that will be a lot more plastic for horses or a lot less, basically. And so what we think is that with the global warming that followed the last glacial maximum, we are talking about, anywhere after 19,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, populations of horses started to collapse a bit. And that's also one of the reasons why archaeologists and paleontologists could not answer those simple questions, is that they don't have tons of fossils. Physically, there were fewer and fewer of them. So as there were fewer and fewer, it took more of migration for one population to connect to the next. And since they were not natural movers, they did not connect. Henceforth, they were differentiating, basically.
So for our listeners, if we could imagine a phylogenetic tree, if I can kind of summarize the sort of detective story. So you went to this place in Kazakhstan, the Botai region, and you found that, there was this lineage of horse that was there that was sort of domesticated. When you looked at all the other domesticated horses, you found that the only horse that actually mapped to this Botai region was I've always pronounced it Przewalski's horse by pronouncing the P, but maybe that's not the correct pronunciation. And all other modern horses were on a completely separate lineage. And where this sort of story took you was this region of the north of the Caucasus Mountains along the Caspian Sea. So you talked about the climatic shifts, and at this time, this would be like, if we had to imagine the environment, mostly like a grassland steppe environment. And so this was an area, I think, that was not glaciated during the Pleistocene. So it did act kind of like as a refugia for the horses to sort of proliferate. Is that a kind of an accurate sort of summary?
Yeah, it's absolutely fair to say that. So if I may add one thing is that, why did we focus on the Botai region in the first place, right? This is something that I want to clarify here. As researchers, when we start such projects, we of course want to get the answers immediately, right? So the Botai thing for us was a sort of a shortcut because archaeologists had a number of hypotheses as to where and when horses were first domesticated. It's not like we started with no hypothesis. There were actually tons of hypotheses, no answers, but many hypotheses. And the hypothesis that was the most consensual, even though it is still debated today, in fact, was the Botai thing. And the reason was very simple, is that archaeologists in the Botai region in Central Asia 5.5 thousand years ago, they see people interacting with almost only one mammal, the horse. And that they can be confident about that because they do the excavations for 3 decades and they uncover 300,000 bones and teeth, tons. 99% of those materials are actually horse-like, so it means that there is no animal that has interacted with those people so much. They can also, archaeologists, unfold not only the bones, but actually enclosures. So, in other words, animals were near their houses, parked, and staying near where they lived, So it sounds like they were intricately related to this animal. And there is even a third evidence for that, is that if you look at not the DNA this time, but, the pots that they uncover, those archaeologists, sometimes you have the dietary crust, things that they were actually cooking that are preserved for 5,000 years. And so when you do the chemical, if you will, analysis of those crusts, you realize that it used to be horse milk. In other words, you have people interacting with tons of horses, keeping them near them, and also drinking their milk. So that was actually a very, 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 very tempting to say, okay, at Botai, horses were first domesticated. And so we went there, we collaborated with people doing the excavations for decades, we sequenced many of them. And that was a big surprise to us because our expectation was that if all started there, they should be the direct ancestors of what we call today the domestic horse. Those you have in the US, those that I have in my country. But in fact, we found the exact opposite. They were the ancestors of the 3,000 animal that we call the Przewalski's horses. So I don't pronounce the P, but I don't know which of us is actually right here.
I'll follow your lead.
Right. It's funny because Przewalski, if you say cheval in French, it means horse, basically. So that's my way to actually stick to the pronunciation.
That'll be my way to remember. Yeah, that's good.
Yes. So what we found that those Botai horses were actually not the ancestors, so not the mother of all the domestic horses, but the only one we called wild, the Przewalski's horses. So that's how we say, wait a minute, it can't be real. When we had this result, we had that in 2016 and 17, we spent a year trying to kill that result. And because we couldn't kill it, we published it in Science in Fact. And that was the start of something I could not have anticipated. Because if you say it's not Botai, then you have to say, where then? And then if you don't have such a neat candidate, you have to go for anywhere else. And anywhere else, it's a large planet we have, right? So that means a lot of work waiting for you.
The detective story.
Yeah. So this bow tie culture has this close relationship with the horse. They domesticate it. The culture collapses, and then we see the emergence of domestication. This would be like quite a bit southwest of the bow tie region,
Northwest.
or northwest, but still in the same type of habitat. So, I mean, you talk a lot in the book about, the close relationship with humans, but in terms of the main drivers of domestication, is the sequence of events sort of thought to be that horses were first hunted for food, and then they were sort of kept in enclosures maybe to have a stable food source, and then they became a source of maybe milk, and then eventually transportation and warfare and all these other things. Would that be the kind of accepted sequence of events?
By and large, absolutely. But I want to clarify one thing, not in a linear way, right? I mean, not like if there was a progress, someone at some point envisioning this sort of path forward. Basically, all this came with a lot of serendipity, I guess. So, because the environment was changing and the different cultures involved and so forth. So, hunting first. Absolutely. We've hunted horses for at least 300,000 years. Us and Neanderthals, pre Neanderthals, and so forth. So, horses are not an exception. We needed to hunt animals to actually survive our past and become the kind of species we have become. So yes, the surprise is that it lasted for a long time, To put that in perspective, cows were domesticated about, 10,000 years ago, maybe 9 to 10,000 years ago. Sheep and goats 11,000 years ago, even pigs 7,000 years ago. So by that I mean that we had, as humans, made the transition to, say, farming and herding a lot earlier with other animals. The mystery with the horse is that this transition came in very late, about 4 to 4.5 thousand years ago. So it took a long time for people to realize or to even need what this animal had to offer, basically. So I think hunting fair. Then hunting plus milking. We shouldn't view, I think, that the minute you start to domesticate an animal, you stop doing what you used to do before with that animal. And in fact, there are some regions where horses are still hunted today. So basically, it's not once you have an innovation, you forget about the past. So there is a moment where you could do both. And this is the way I picture the Botai people. They were settled hunter-gatherers. We know that from the archaeology. And when you're settled, if your resource becomes thin, you don't have the luxury to go walk and found another place because you're settled. So we think that because the horse population shrank, they were sort of forced to develop a sort of more resilient or sustainable relationship with this animal because for them it was a matter of survival. So you realize that if you picture the situation like this, it's not necessarily that some great minds of the Botai people came with a genius idea of, oh, let's do something out of the blue. It's probably because their environment required them to actually sort of adapt their life ways into what became the new situation. But those people, it's not just as a culture they vanished, they also vanished as people. We lose their DNA trace of humans also. So you have a situation where they did not make it, actually, right? And so that's probably also why the horse could actually go back into the wild, survive into what we call today the wild animal, the Przewalski's horse, and because of other environments somewhere else. The climate changed around 4.2 thousand years ago. The climate became a lot drier in the region of the southwestern Russian steppe. And so probably it triggered a sort of new series of innovations. I'm not saying that people, were climate experts at that stage, but clearly their survival depended on them being able to find their food, move around, and so forth. So if they were herding already sheep, cows, as we know, maybe by having the horse now as a mobility engine, right, as a sort of vehicle, then for them it became a lot easier or maybe more possible to go somewhere else faster. So that means to find some pasture lands in an easier way than they could before. And so that was a sort of relationship that was purely driven, I think, by economy, right? What is it that I need to make it as a human group, basically? But of course, you don't have a long history with horses, you said, right? But there are horse people around lots. And what strikes me with horse people is that they can actually communicate with the animal. They have developed such a great perception of what the animal intends to do or is going to do. And so probably, there is also this that was unfolding. Maybe some people felt attracted a lot more to this animal than to another one, right? Because they feel like one. And really, horse people will tell you that a lot, right? I don't need words. I already understand that sort of other kind, basically. And so
The horse whisperer.
exactly. And so if you have these sort of things adding on, right, you don't necessarily need to have just one incentive. But actually, depending on the region, for very different reasons, people started to interact their own way with this sort of new bloodline that was sort of engineered, where we said, like southwestern Russian steppe.
Yeah. So you said just a minute ago, and this has intrigued me. I didn't know until reading the book that the horse was really the last major domesticate, right? So is it, in light of what you're saying, I think maybe I know the answer, but I'm wondering, do you think we can ever get to an answer about, was it its sort of ability to be a mode of transportation that the other domesticates don't really lend themselves to? Is that what sort of set it off? And or is that also why maybe it took so long to domesticate this species when, there was thousands of years of success with others? Is it just really hard for this species, or why is that?
I don't think so. It's really hard. And the reason why I'm saying that is that we did it twice, and probably many more times, because we only see the successful attempts, right? We don't see those that failed, really. So probably people have developed a number of interactions. And so also in our data, the one that kickstarted what we call horse domestication anywhere somewhere between 4,000 to 4,500 years ago, it's not so long. It's a few centuries, right? I mean, centuries sounds like, okay, it's a long time, but in fact, it's pretty much a blink at the evolutionary timescale, basically. So because of that, I don't think it's so complicated. Also, I can be backed up by some of my colleagues who have attempted to domesticate de novo, for example, foxes, silver foxes, and they managed to do that in really a dozen of generations, which means in my lifetime, I could have domesticated that animal if I intended to do so. So I think we should refrain from thinking that interacting with life around is so impossible, so difficult. In fact, you just have to find the right keys, to understand enough of the animal so that you can have them start with their own agency, actually start to engage in this sort of bilateral non-human animal relationship. So, but for sure, with our data, what was the trigger was this mobility thing, because, it was a tiny bit of the world where you had this bloodline, and in 300 years at most, all of a sudden, it was all across Eurasia, from Spain, the Atlantic, to Korea, the Pacific, right? So it's insane in terms of how fast that thing went. And of course, when you have the horse, it doesn't give you only movement. Of course, you will have movements, but warfare will be totally upside down with the horse. Imagine yourself as a pedestrian at war, charged by an army on a horseback.
Yeah, you're terrifying Cam here.
Right. It's one of my nightmares as well, right? So clearly imagine this. So that means that even though you wouldn't have naturally engaged with the animal, now you didn't have the choice anymore. If your enemies have the horse, you have no choice. You must have it as well. Otherwise, you will be eradicated at war, right? So basically, you can see a self-entertaining process that was a sort of evolutionary arm race that the horse started.
Hi there. You've been listening to the free version of Big Biology. To hear the rest of this episode, you need to subscribe.
To do that, head to bigbiology.substack.com and sign up for a paid subscription. There are a lot of different membership options available.
Not only will you get access to the rest of this episode, you'll also get access to extras like our episode debriefs, behind-the-scene content from Keating, our artist, about how he makes the cover art for each show, and more from our guests about their path to science and their hobbies.